Now, many of you watching this video right now may have a job that you work at for a living, be it part-time or full-time. And most of you more than likely have this constant feeling that you're dreading Mondays and that you're just, living for the weekend. Or if you're like me and your job involves like shift patterns and also working on weekends, you can probably relate to the feeling of counting down the hours that go by during each shift and that feeling of just trying to make the most of your days off, even though they seem to fly by, whilst your time in work seems to go very slowly. Now, if these feelings sound at all relatable to you, then I'd recommend that you'd stick around, because I'm really going to try to explain what those feelings actually mean by diving into Marx's theory of alienation. I'll basically be explaining what it is and how, more than ever, it's still relevant and applicable to the real world around us. So just like one of my previous videos on the falling rate of profit, I think it was, which if you haven't seen, by the way, I will link it in the description below, today's video will also be pretty basic. The reason for this is because there may be people watching this right now who might not be so clued up on the works of Marx and Engels, because they wrote quite extensively on this sort of stuff. But while this video is going to be very basic, I do want to stress that it really shouldn't be seen as a substitute for actually going away and reading up on this work, but instead this video, as well as the video about the falling rate of profit I did back in September, I think it was, it should be seen as more of like an introduction to these works by Marx and Engels. Now, in order to understand the concept of alienation, we must first begin to understand what actually causes the phenomenon to begin with in the first place, and that cause is the capitalist system and how it works. Production under capitalism fundamentally relies on the existence of two main classes. The first is the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie, if you want the fancy word, and the capitalists are the ones who own the means of production. So they basically own the workplaces and live off the surplus value which is created by the labour put in by the working class. Some examples of capitalists nowadays would be the owners of multinational corporations, so people like Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, or people like Elon Musk, who owns Tesla. So all of this wealth that capitalists have, it was created by workers. The capitalists don't do any work that creates wealth themselves. They become rich literally on the backs of workers. Their income is solely based on the fact that they own means of production. This is how they differ from the petty bourgeois people, which are basically the small business owners who own very small scale means of production but also perform labour themselves. But since wealth is now being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, and petty bourgeois people often struggle to compete with the monopoly capitalists, many find themselves having to return to being proletarians, which, speaking of, brings me to the next point. Now, for the capitalist class to be able to find workers who are willing to sell their labour power to them, there has to be a class of people who have no ownership over any means of production whatsoever. This class of people are known as proletarians, and they are basically wage workers. Now, the way in which workers are employed by capitalists is not very voluntary at all. Despite what right-wingers might say to you, the proletarians basically have no choice at all in the matter. Why is that the case? Well, because of their relationship with the means of production, they are thereby threatened by destitution and are thereby coerced into selling their labour power to the capitalists in order to get an income. Now, that doesn't sound particularly voluntary to me. Now, as an example, how many times have you had to bite your tongue in a job interview because you just want to say, well, I'm quite passionate about not starving to death, or something like, I need this job because I'm broke and I can't pay my bills. Now, I'm a proletarian. I don't own any means of production, and this relationship that I, along with many people where I live, and indeed all over the world, have with the means of production, means that we literally have no choice but to go to work to make a living. Otherwise, we'd either have to live on benefits, which of course is no life at all, because you really don't get much on the dole as it is. Or alternatively, we'd end up homeless and we'd have no way to provide for ourselves, because unfortunately we live under a system where houses are seen as investment opportunities rather than places for people to live. So some people watching right now might be wondering how these two classes came about. So how did capitalists come about and how did proletarians come about? And that's what I'm going to explain now. The capitalist class originally developed with the feudal system, and though they weren't anything like the capitalists we see nowadays, who own stocks in like multinational corporations, they were basically merchants, so a much smaller version of what we would now know as capitalists. Now what these merchant capitalists were doing was, because their interests as a class went against the interests of the aristocracy and the feudal nobility who owned all of the land, it all led to a very intense class struggle between the aristocracy and the capitalists. And this is what eventually led to the period of the Enlightenment, where you had things like the struggle against absolute monarchy, against the rule of the church, and things like demands for a republic with a written constitution. Now this all led to events such as Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians overthrowing Charles I and the British monarchy during the English Civil War of the 1640s. To a small extent, it also led to the American War of Independence back in the 1770s and the 1780s, and to a much larger extent, this period of the Enlightenment and the struggle of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy was what led to the French Revolution happening the way it did back in 1789, in which the French aristocracy was overthrown and quite brutally abolished as well, with the French bourgeoisie actually putting the heads of the king and the queen under the guillotine and saying, you know, this is the dawn of a new era now, to hell with you, we're gonna get rid of this feudal filth. Now while this intense class struggle was happening between the capitalists and the nobility, the peasants who owned their own tiny strip of land to provide for themselves and their village, they found themselves unable to compete with all of the merchants who were now beginning to have all of these big workshops and factories. So as capitalism was developing, the peasants actually were in a way removed from the land and had no choice but to migrate to the towns and the cities, because, you know, that's where all the jobs are now, and they had to make a living. So they ended up having to become proletarians through no choice of their own. So the peasants were eventually just wiped out. This is kind of why, if you look at capitalist countries nowadays, you'll often find that the towns and the cities are always full of people and are hustling and bustling, whilst the countryside and the more rural parts are quite sparsely populated in comparison. Now I live in a pretty rural part of Carmarthenshire in Wales. Even just looking at the town of Carmarthen, which is literally just about a 20-minute drive from my neck of the woods, like immediately you can see the difference in population density. But then if you go to somewhere like Cardiff, or even over the border, like over the Severn Bridge to places like Bristol or London, which is generally where most of all of the high-paying jobs are in my country, then the difference in population density is absolutely huge. Because where I live, it's basically a ghost town. There's nothing here. Like, all we've got is just a couple of pubs, petrol station, parks, bus stop. That's about it. Now it's very important to understand that even though communists are generally very hostile towards capitalism, it's important to recognise that we also understand that compared to the old feudal system, capitalism was actually very progressive because of how it brought about the next stage of historical development. Marx and Engels themselves even pointed this out, because it created all of these huge productive forces like factories, mines, shipping yards, and railways that helped in the development of these productive forces during the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, the reason why communists are anti-capitalist is because capitalism has also created its own contradictions, like economic crashes and recessions, and like nowadays it's created environmental catastrophe, and none of these things can be fixed within the capitalist framework. So these contradictions end up becoming a hindrance for societal development. Now all of this is quite important to understand, because the next segment of this video is kind of where I cut to the chase. Now, Karl Marx argued that what makes us humans very unique as a species out of all of the other animals on this planet is that we are intelligent enough to be able to consciously and collectively labour on the world and essentially transform it. This sort of labour is what produces goods and basically the world around us as we know it. It was basically what produced society and civilization. But Marx went even further with this analysis and realised that the problem that we face under capitalism particularly is that this ability that we humans have is taken away. So the things workers produce are not produced for people as individuals, or even for the society as a whole. They are produced solely for profit. The process of labour under capitalism is thereby dominated by the needs and demands of capital, as opposed to the needs and demands of society. This is what has the huge impact. It's basically the reason why you seem to hate Mondays, and this huge division of labour is what leads to humans becoming very much like machines. This is what ties in to the basic definition of alienation, if you like, which is the process where the workers who are doing the work and producing all of the goods and running all of the services are then made to feel foreign to the products of their labour. Now, the more we think about it, I think a lot of us can probably relate to it as well. The fact that we as workers have no control over the means of production is kind of what leads to that depressing feeling of work actually beginning to control you and rendering you powerless. So your workplace is not just out of your control, it's basically taking you over. Marx himself even wrote quite a bit on this himself. I think it was in his work called The Economic and Political Manuscript. He basically explained that this process of alienation takes its biggest toll on the workers themselves. This is basically what he said, quote, "The fact that labour is external to the worker, that is, it does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside of his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he does not feel at home. His labour is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labour. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it." Close quote. So looking at this quote now, you can sort of see how the workers being faced with the choice to either sell their labour power to the capitalist or basically just to starve and die means that alienation really does have its most extreme and characteristic form among workers while they're at work. These workers are not producing for the good of society, let alone for themselves as individuals. These workers are labouring according to the demands of the capitalist class, and those demands are profit and accumulation. The thing with alienation though, as with all societal contradictions under capitalism, it doesn't just stay within the boundaries of the immediate production process in the workplace. Alienation also affects workers in their personal and social lives too, and that's precisely because of how the production relations under capitalism go on to shape society as a whole. So this is why alienation goes on to affect our personal lives, our relationships with other people and so forth. And because capitalism goes on to affect the social and economic relations that people have with each other, this phenomenon is also what leads to people like Andrew Tate floating about on the internet, just peddling this nonsensical hatred for women. And likewise, if you're on TikTok, you have probably come across aspects of toxic femininity as you're scrolling through your For You page as well, like videos of women saying pretty nasty things along the lines of men don't have feelings, or things like, if my man isn't rich, then I'm gonna leave him because he can't provide for me, and all that bollocks. Now, even before the internet became a thing, this kind of toxic relationship was seen between people all the time. It's the reason why you'd see couples getting married for the sole purpose of financial security, and not because they actually love each other. So the production relations under capitalism lead to people having these kind of skewed relationships with each other. Now, being completely powerless in your workplace whilst doing the very thing that makes you human, you can sort of see how that would then go on to affect everything else in your life too. And this is how alienation inevitably gets to the stage where our very wants and needs are so distorted in such a way that they can only ever be met if they contribute to the accumulation of profit. So again serving the needs and demands of capital. Like, this is kind of the reason why we have a mental health crisis in capitalist countries nowadays. Alienation is a huge factor that has caused the mental health crisis that we see in a lot of people. Now, I remember my days at school, as an example, when I used to see kids getting bullied and picked on for the make of their clothes, or the fact that they don't have the latest iPhone, or the latest video game console, etc. Like, fuck, I remember when I was in school, there was a big bun fight between people who had the PlayStation 4 and people who had, like, the Xbox One. And if you didn't have either one of those consoles, you were basically seen as a loser. But then there was always that one kid in the back who had a PC and they'd be... Alienation is the primary cause of all of this as well, since capitalism has formulated people's wants and needs to serve the demands of the market. Like, even the internet, which has so much potential for the collective good of society in terms of things like education and social inclusion, it's under private ownership. And it's because of the capitalist production relations that something as wonderful as the internet has been built to specifically formulate our wants and needs around the demands of capital and the market. To explain this in simpler terms, think of when you open up the internet. The first thing that's going to happen, guaranteed, you're going to be bombarded by adverts and brands like buy this, buy that. Now, I remember watching a meme compilation, as you do in your spare time as a person my age. You know, you could show me a well-performed stand-up and I'll chuckle, but then show me a video of a slice of bread falling over, or a clip of a dog looking into a doorbell camera, or, you know, a picture of a blurry bag with a bass noise over it. I'll be on the fucking floor. Now, of course, a lot of memes, even though they're funny, many usual memes the average person would see on the internet are heavily based around brands and products, which again distorts our wants and needs. So you can start to see how alienation starts to affect people's understanding of the world around them and the way that they think. Even the capitalists, so the ruling class, even they feel the effects of this alienation. However, due to their position of having ownership over the means of production, they're a lot more comfortable in their alienation than the working classes, which basically means that they are not really going to try and resist it. Nevertheless, this process also does affect their understanding of the world around them and how they think. So how can alienation be overcome? Well, first of all, to answer that question, alienation is a problem that is endemic to capitalism, and the contradictions within the capitalist system simply cannot be solved through maintaining the very system that causes those contradictions to begin with. So to find a solution to alienation, we really have to look at the root cause of it, and that's capitalism and private ownership over the means of production. The solution involves completely overthrowing capitalism and having the working people take over the means of production by building a socialist state and working towards the stage of communism. Capitalism is a system that has to be overthrown if we are to bring any real change to the lives of ordinary working class people. We can't achieve workplace democracy, let alone democracy itself in the true sense of the word, if the rich people are still controlling everything. But of course, people might say to you, oh, if you feel alienated, if you hate your job, just go and find another job. Like, okay, fair enough, leaving your job because you hate it does give you that temporary relief, but this happiness you feel is only really temporary. That's the key word there. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this scenario of just leaving one job because you hate it and then just landing a different job that you also end up hating. The relief that many people feel when moving from one job to another is relatively short-lived, and that's precisely because of how alienation is a systemic problem as opposed to like a local problem seen in one workplace. So this is why the solution has to be in line with systemic change, because hopping from one job to another, you're only going to experience the exact same problem. And I suppose it's exactly the same for people who suddenly decide, you know what, fuck it, I'm going to start my own business to engage in my passion for like painting or music or whatever, because the passion that you feel for whatever it is that you're doing is eventually sucked out of you because the alienation hits you and then changes your mentality from, hey, I'm engaging in my passion, to I have to pay my rent, pay my bills, and put food on the table so that I don't end up homeless and fucking die. Now this brings it all back to the quote by Marx that I read out earlier. So within the confines of capitalism, just hopping from one job to another, that might help some of the symptoms of alienation, but it doesn't actually solve the problem itself. It doesn't get to the root cause of it. This is why the solution lies in revolutionary change, because alienation is a systemic problem that no individual solution can fix. We live in a mode of production that forces us to work mundane jobs just to barely afford the most basic necessities, due to how capitalism is dominated by the profit motive. So even the most basic necessities like food, housing, healthcare, electricity and heating, they're just commodities to be bought and sold. This is why there is mass starvation in third world countries, and even in a first world country like the United States. This very profit motive is the reason why so many Americans can't afford to go to the hospital, because if you can't afford health insurance, then you're basically fucked. Like even here in Britain, which is like I think the 5th richest country in the world or something like that, you could swear it's like something out of a dystopian book or something. We have queues of people using food banks because they can't make ends meet, and the increasing number of people using food banks are actually in work, and some even have more than one job because they're in dire straits. There are even families having to choose between either cooking food or putting the heating on. And bear in mind, this is happening whilst the British government is putting forward policies that actively serve the interests of the capitalists, who are just making a killing out of the misery of the people. And though revolutionary change might sound like a long-term solution, which it more than likely is because of the conditions of the First World in particular, where it's clear to see that there is a huge lack of class consciousness among the general public, it doesn't change the fact that this long-term solution holds the key to eradicating the problem of alienation and other societal contradictions like it. A way to engage in contributing to this long-term solution in the here and now would be to join a trade union in your workplace, or even better, get involved with your local communist party. Having that vanguard, which consists of class-conscious workers actually going out there into the community, using the mass line and applying revolutionary tactics to the conditions of ordinary people, is the most effective way of carrying out a revolution, and historically this has been the case. Hence the reason why revolutionary change doesn't just happen overnight. It takes a lot of hard work, planning and dedication to the people to actually happen, and for it to remain organic. Now I don't know if they do this in other countries, but the Communist Party here in Britain organises at a local level at the moment, because they're still pretty small and they're not owned by like billionaires like all of the mainstream political parties are. Now they have branches up and down Britain, so they have a local branch for Wales, one for Scotland, and loads of different local branches for different areas in England as well. And because they organise on a local level, they do also run in local elections as well. They're often chastised as reformists for doing this, but honestly I think it's a very good step forward, because by doing that they're putting themselves out there for the masses to see them. Plus they also organise within the trade union movement as well, which means that when they're out there campaigning or agitating or rallying with striking workers or organising food banks in community centres, they actually stop and talk to people, which means that they can continuously remain consistent and constantly adapt their tactics to ever-changing material conditions. This is exactly what the Bolsheviks did. Like before they became such a popular movement, the Bolsheviks started off as an anti-war movement in opposition to the Russian Empire's involvement in the First World War. It was because of their use of the mass line, of them actually going out and organising workers and peasants together, the fact that the Bolshevik party as the vanguard was actually in tune to what the people were going through at that time, that the socialist revolution in 1917 was carried out successfully and enabled the establishment of the world's very first worker state, the Soviet Union. The same worker state that went on to strike fear into the rich and powerful in the latter half of the 20th century.